Is time travel possible? The next couple of stories are documented cases that were supposedly true, where people have vanished and reappeared. The last story will be my own personal story, though it may not fall under the topic of time travel. The first story was published in Supernatural Vanishings, and Davies uncovered a story of Peter Williamson, who mysteriously vanished, apparently after being struck by lightning. On the evening of July 28, 1974, Peter Williamson, his wife Mary, and their 2 children gave a barbecue at their house for a group of friends. The weather had been uncomfortably warm and humid all day, and as people arrived at the Williamson house, the sky was turning dark with storm clouds. The rain and lightning did not stop the party, as they were safe and dry under a covered porch. It was not long afterwards that one of Williamson's children noticed the family's dog was cowering under a bush on the opposite side of the lawn. Peter ran out into the rain to rescue the dog when suddenly a huge flash of lightning struck a nearby tree. Peter seemed to be strangely illuminated by the lightning's flash. Unexpectedly, in front of the entire group of people, Peter vanished from sight. His wife Mary and the children screamed, and the others ran out into the rain to see what had actually happened. But despite their frantic search, which took them all over the high-walled garden, they found no sign of Peter Williamson. The police were called in, and the area around the house was searched for any evidence to shed light on what had happened to Williamson. 3 days later, the Williamsons' gardener found his missing employer lying semi-conscious in some shrubbery at the end of the garden. The returned Peter Williamson was completely unharmed, yet strangely was dressed somewhat differently from when he had vanished. Williamson was taken to a local hospital where it was determined that apart from being in a state of shock, he was suffering from nothing worse than amnesia. Frustratingly for all concerned, Peter could remember nothing of what had happened to him. After a brief stay in the hospital, Williamson went home to fully recuperate. Peter soon began to have a series of disjointed graphic dreams that seemed to show what had happened to him during those lost 60 hours. In his dreams, Peter found himself coming to in another garden, his clothes soaked through, but without knowing where he was or how he got there. Close by the garden, Peter noticed there was a narrow road, and he staggered to his feet in the dreams and made it for it. He walked along the road for some distance until he began to feel so weak and ill that he sat down alongside to rest. Fortunately, a passing motorist who happened to be a doctor stopped and offered assistance. When the doctor learned Peter had lost his memory, he drove him to a hospital. There, Peter was admitted, but he was completely unable to tell the staff his name or address, and as he carried no identification, nothing could be learned about him or his situation. The doctors were baffled by his condition, but told Peter he might regain his memory in a few days. In his dreams, Peter remembered that the ward in which he was placed seemed to shimmer eerily, and that his doctor's name was Nugent, and the ward's sister's name was Alice Charles. He also recalled that his voice was slurred and unusually slow compared with the brisk, clear tones of the doctors and the nurses. Peter dreamed that on the second day at the hospital, when he felt better, he told the nurse in charge he wanted to get up and take a short walk. He was told, however, that his jeans had been thrown away because they were stained and torn. The man in the next bed, hearing Peter's plight, offered to loan Peter a pair of brown corduroy trousers, He gratefully accepted them, slipped on the rest of his clothes, and walked down to the hospital cafe. On the third day, Peter took a longer walk and found the road that led back to the garden where he had first awakened to discover he had amnesia. This is where his dreams would end, giving no clue how he ended up back in his own yard. Peter soon realized that his dreams might be actual repressed memories of his 3-day ordeal. This was confirmed when he found the brown corduroy trousers, which had been loaned to him by the man in his dream, hanging in his closet where they had been placed by his wife. He knew that if he could trace the owner, he would be able to both return them and find out where the strange hospital was found. He could see that the pants were new, and from the label he found that they had been made by Herbert Cox, a West Country manufacturer. They also bore the owner's initials JB, monogrammed right into the label. Yet, when he tried to locate the manufacturer, he was dismayed to discover that they had been out of business since 1954, which was 20 years prior. Sometime later, Peter went to the local hospital for a checkup and, by chance, overheard a Dr. Nugent being mentioned. He asked where he might find that physician and was told that Dr. Nugent was employed at the cottage hospital that stood not more than a half a mile from his own home. Peter had not known of the hospital's existence, yet it seemed obvious that it must be where the doctor had taken him. On leaving the local hospital, he went straight to the cottage hospital, recognizing both the approach road and the hospital and its grounds. Peter finally met Dr. Nugent. He was surprised that the doctor seemed older than he had remembered. Where his hair had been dark, his temples were now thinning and gray. Dr. Nugent did not return Peter's welcoming smile with the burst of recognition that he had expected. In fact, the man did not seem to recognize him at all, so Peter introduced himself and explained that he was the amnesia victim that Dr. Nugent had recently treated. The physician looked hard at him, shook his head, and said to Peter, "I'm afraid you have the wrong hospital, old chap. I've never seen you before, and I haven't had an amnesia case for a number of years." What can we make of this case? Did Peter Williamson suffer from amnesia and wander the countryside and in daze for 3 days until somehow he found his way back home again? Or, more incredibly, had Peter been thrown out of his time into the past by a blast of lightning? Other cases of temporal displacement appear to have been initiated by some form of outside catalyst, often close lightning strikes. In this next story, it was in the Fate issue magazine of September 1956. Miriam Golding wrote about her unusual experience, which occurred in the fall of 1934 when she stepped out of an elevator and became unstuck in time. Miriam and her fiancé were riding a crowded elevator in a Chicago music store when she got off on the wrong floor and found it impossible to get back on the crowded elevator. After the elevator containing her fiancé left, Miriam looked around her and was startled to see she was not in a downtown building at all, but in a large railroad station. She watched crowds of travelers hurrying about. Railroad announcers gave times of departures and arrivals, and Miriam could hear the sounds of train engines as they arrived and left the terminal. Miriam approached the information booth, but was completely ignored by the girl behind the counter. It was like Miriam was invisible to everyone around her. At last, Miriam noticed a "To the Street" sign and followed it into the open air. It seemed to be a beautiful midsummer afternoon. A new red brick building was being built across the street from the station. Crowds of people walked by on the streets, but everyone ignored Miriam as she tried to ask for directions. She wandered aimlessly for several minutes until she noticed a teenage boy standing near the center of the sidewalk, staring in all directions. She approached the boy, hardly daring to hope that he might see her. Then he noticed her and smiled. "I guess they let you off at the wrong stop, too." Miriam immediately understood that, however fantastic, the same thing had happened to both of us. Our mutual plight created a bond, and for want of anything better to do, we continued together down the street. The boy explained that he had been playing tennis in Lincoln, Nebraska. He had gone into a locker room to change his shoes, and when he came out, he found himself inexplicably in the same train depot. Eventually, they found themselves in an open country where Miriam saw her fiancé's sister with a number of other girls on a sandbar in the middle of a river. They noticed her too and began to call her name and wave at her. Her new friend became very excited. Perhaps the girls formed some kind of connection or link between times. "It's not far to swim," he told Miriam. "They see us. I know I can make it to them in a few minutes." The figures of the girls remained on the sandbar, but the teenager, even though he was a strong swimmer, could not reach the sandbar. Exhausted, he returned to shore and fell to the ground in discouragement. When they looked again at the sandbar, both and all the girls had disappeared. Miriam felt despondent. Would she be forever trapped in this other time? Then she became suddenly enveloped in darkness. She felt as if she were floating through space. Suddenly, she found herself on a stool in the music store, a magazine spread out before her. A clock was signaling closing time. Miriam looked around for her fiancé, but she could not see him. She decided to go to his house. "When I got to my destination," Miriam Golden wrote, "my fiancé opened the door. He certainly looked relieved. He said he'd lost me on the elevator. After stepping out on the main floor, he had been unable to locate me. Thinking I had gotten off on some other floor, he waited a while, decided to go home." Miriam entered the home and was surprised to see her fiancé's sister was the same friends she had seen on the sandbar. The sister smiled and said that she had seen Miriam in a town. "But you were so engrossed in each other you didn't even hear us." Miriam Golden was one of the lucky ones. For some unknown reason, she found herself lost in time. However, unlike others who have probably found themselves in similar situations, she was somehow able to return to her own time and place. Some questions remain, though. What happened to the teenager that accompanied her? Why did her fiancé's sister see her with her fiancé instead of the teenager? It's pretty interesting. This third story is actually my own story that had happened with myself on two separate occasions. This had happened. So I'm going back to, I'm guesstimating probably 2003 or 2004, and now it's 2017. But it was in the evening here at the house, and I had made steak for dinner, but I was not sitting at the table. I had actually gotten up and I had gone into my living room to sit down. As I was sitting in the chair in the living room eating the steak, I was watching TV, and a commercial had actually come on. And as I was watching this commercial, all of a sudden the entire room that I was sitting in changed. I could still hear the commercial, but it was like, it was in the background kind of, and all of a sudden I was on like a grassy path, and I was walking barefoot. Luckily I didn't drop the steak, but it was like almost like I could hear the sounds of the commercial, but they somehow were in like a reality form as where I was walking on this path, because I could hear the birds, I could feel the weather outside, I could smell the air that was fresh, and I don't know how long this had lasted. I heard like a babbling brook also like in the distance, and I knew that it was on like the left of me behind some trees. And then as quick as that had come on, I was back in the chair and I was eating the steak, and I had the most bizarre feeling come over me. Now, granted, it may not be trying like a time travel thing. It may have been like, I don't know. Some would say maybe remembering a past life. Who knows? But I'll tell you what. My entire living room was gone. There was no steak on my lap. I was standing up. I was walking barefooted on this grassy path that was on the side of the woods. Another time I was with Roger and we were coming down Herkimer Road. I can't exactly remember. I believe it was from Schuyler coming into Frankfurt. And all of a sudden, that same feeling had come over me. And like for just a moment, everything had like changed. And then the next thing you know, I'm back sitting in the truck. Talk about the most displaced feeling in the world. I can't even begin to describe what it feels like. You would have to actually experience this strange feeling. The closest that even comes to it is how you feel when you have a deja vu for a split second, like you've been there and done it. It's like that, but it's like accentuated times 10. So, is it possible to be displaced in time? That is one question that you really have to ponder or experience for yourself. I hope you guys enjoyed listening to this little clip of time travel stories. Please go down below here on YouTube and click subscribe for some more interesting stories and everyday life of Simply Sue.